Okay, picking up with our final type of tissue, which is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue covers all of our body surfaces, including lining our body cavities and each of our individual organs. All epithelial tissues contain what we call a free surface, the outside, and a basement membrane, the thing that's attached to the body, the lining or the body cavity, the organ, or basically the bottom of the tissue. The free surface will be the part specialized to perform whatever function it is doing, like protection, secretion, or absorption. The basement membrane is the layer that's not made of cells, but that binds the epithelial cells to the connective tissue that's underneath. And this is so they are not lost or stretched out. Epithelial tissue are another great example of that form follows function idea we were talking about. The shape of the cell is suited to the function that that cell performs. And epithelial cells come in three basic shapes: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Squamous epithelial cells are flattened, and these form the linings of blood vessels and the lungs. And their flattened shape makes them very, very thin. And this allows oxygen and carbon dioxide and other materials to diffuse across the membrane very quickly. They have a very short distance to travel to be able to get into and out of the cell. Cuboidal epithelial cells are cube-like in shape, and these specialize in secretion and absorption. And these are what makes up the cells of our glands. So our glandular tissue are cuboidal epithelial cells. Columnar epithelial cells are column-shaped, tall and thin, and they're specialized for absorption. So these are what's going to line the lining of the small intestine, where we're going to be absorbing a lot of our nutrients and needing that process to be very fast. Their columnar shape gives them those finger-like folds on the outer surface, so they have increased surface area and can absorb more quickly. But no matter what shape they are, epithelial cells can either be simple, having one layer, or stratified, having multiple layers. So the skin, our integument, is an example of a stratified epithelial cells that provide many layers of protection. Let's take a look at some examples here. So here we have a stratified multiple layers of squamous epithelial cells, squished and thin. Second, we've got examples of cuboidal epithelial cells. This is specifically a glandular structure oriented in those rings, specialized in secretion. And then here's a really clear example of columnar epithelial cells. That's the lining actually of our trachea. So just like our stomach lining is specialized for absorbing those solid materials, our trachea lining needs to be specialized for absorbing oxygen and carbon dioxide. Emitting carbon dioxide. So absorbing oxygen quickly, we're going to use all that increased surface area of those columnar epithelial cells. All the nuclei are stacked at the top, leaving all of this room open to absorb or take in what's needed from the outside. Sometimes they're going to be lined with what we call cilia, and those are these little hair-like projections on the tops of the cells. And that's, again, just for increased surface area to be able to take in as much material as possible. As we are going through these 11 human body systems, as the next 2 or 3 modules of this class is going through each of those 11 body systems. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind as we're doing that is what body tissues are present and what functions are they performing. And would they be able to perform those functions on their own, or do they need to be connected to other types of tissues? So we're going to see a lot of those tissues working together to perform complex functions as we go through each of these individual body systems. Before we do that, let's look at how we study the body kind of as a whole. So our first question was, what is the difference between anatomy and physiology? Looking at the anatomy of an organism is the study of its morphology, its form or shape. So basically studying all of the parts of the organism. Gross anatomy refers to what you could see with your naked eye. So typically we think of that as being at the organ level and above. You mainly study gross anatomy by doing dissections. Histology is the study of microscopic anatomy. So we've looked at the tissues, the slide images of all of those tissues and the individual cells under the microscope, and those were called histological sections. Regional anatomy is the study of all the structures within a specific region of your body. So for example, you might go to a podiatrist for a problem with your foot, and they will be familiar with the whole region, including the skeletal, muscular systems, tendons, all of the systems that are contained within that region of the foot. And then there is systemic anatomy, which is the study of all the structures that are functionally related. Example would be a gynecologist has studied all of the parts of the reproductive system and how they work together. So even though they're not contained within a specific region of the body, then they're still going to be familiar with all of the functional parts of that system. Those were all examples of anatomy, the structure of the body. Physiology, on the other hand, is how do those parts function? How do they work? So naming all of the parts of the cranial cavity or the lobes of the brain is anatomical. But describing the way that the synapse fires to relay a message from the brain to another part of the body is an example of a physiological process. We started this class with some basic chemistry and describing how cells are capable of talking to each other so that they can understand some of the mechanisms behind these physiological processes. But physiology, how does it function? How does it work? When we are referencing parts of the body, we talk about them in terms of which body cavity they're found in. The dorsal cavity refers to the dorsal or back part of the body. The cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and the vertebral or spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord, are both found within the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity is continuous, which means that there's nothing separating one part of the cavity from another. The brain is directly connected to the spinal cord, so that's continuous. The ventral cavity, or the front cavity, on the other hand, has two divisions separated from the diaphragm. So the ventral cavity is not continuous. It has that diaphragm separating its sections. All of our visceral organs are housed in the ventral cavity. The thoracic cavity is like the chest region and has 3 of its own subdivisions. Each lung is in a pleural cavity, and the heart is in the mediastinum. Also within the ventral cavity is the abdominopelvic cavity, which is our gut region. And remember, all of those are lined with epithelial tissue and loose connective tissue. So as we go through the semester and we're discussing all of the pieces in between or inside each of those cavities, we're also looking at how they're connected together through those connective tissues and how they're protected by those epithelial tissues. We can describe the location of a body part by its relative position to another body part. So superior versus inferior. Superior means above, and inferior means below. So when you hear surgeons say, make a superior cut, they don't mean let's make the best cut we can. They mean make a cut above something. The knee is superior to the foot because it's closer to the cranial cavity or closer to the top of the body. The foot is inferior to the knee because it's closer to the caudal end or closer to the bottom. anterior versus posterior, or we can also say ventral versus dorsal. So anterior means the same as ventral, and that means towards the front of the body. Posterior or dorsal means towards the back. The nose is on the ventral side of the body, and it is anterior to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is on the dorsal side of the body and is posterior to the nose. Medial and lateral refer to an object's position in relation to the midline of the body. The midline of the body runs down the middle. A very wobbly midline, but you get the idea. Right down the middle cuts the body in half so that each half contains both a ventral and dorsal side. If something is closer to the midline, then it's considered medial. And if it's further away from the midline, it is considered lateral. Proximal versus distal are describing an object's location as being close to or farther away from something else. And we have to define that something else as the reference point. So this is often used when talking about appendages and using the joint as the reference point. So the foot is distal, farther away from the body than the knee. You can think of this as proximal is closer in proximity, and distal is a greater distance away. Then we can describe something based on how deep it is within the body cavity. So that's superficial versus deep. Something that is superficial is close to the surface of the body, and something that is deep is well below the surface. So our skin, our integument, would be our most superficial organ, and the heart or the stomach would be considered a deep organ, deep within the body. You'll get some practice using these terms in our lecture outline for this week. We can also describe the body by cutting it into different sections. The body sections describe how you can divide the body or an individual organ within the body. So the sagittal plane divides the body along the midline into right and left portions. So just like we drew a line down the midline, if we were to cut the body along the sagittal plane, it would just be cutting it along the midline. The coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior. So front, anterior, posterior, back. And the transverse plane divides the body into upper and lower sections, in superior versus inferior. That's like the magician's assistant's cut, the transverse plane. We can also, as well as cutting the entire body into those sections, figuratively, right, to just think about how things are put together. We can also dissect individual organs or the entire plane that way. So this might be useful to see how organs or tissues are connected together in the body at different angles. So we've got a transverse cut here, and we're looking down at the lower portion of the body. So we can see that how the spinal cord and the kidneys and the body cavity and all of the veins and blood vessels interact and sit together within the body. But you could also take sections of individual body parts. This would be a coronal cut of the brain, separating the posterior, the back, from the anterior, the front. And that would be a good way to see how the lobes are connected together. So this would be a good way to study general anatomy, these body sections. If you ever get a chance to see the show Body Worlds, it's very, very good, but it displays a lot of body cuts similar to what we're discussing here. Okay, I'll see you in part 3 for our discussion of the integumentary system.